Hello again. I don't do that many videos in English, but it's always a pleasure for me to be back in English, especially this time because it is a topic that's very dear to my heart. I'm going to show you my most inclusive tarot decks. Well, actually not in that video here, because I'm also really annoying as a person and I want to define what inclusivity is or isn't, why I'm not so fond of it actually, and I want us to project our gaze, our considerations and our struggles and rights further than actual inclusivity. So that's a bit of everything that we're gonna talk about in this first video before I show you all of my cool inclusive decks, because ever since I started learning tarot 6 years ago, it's been something that I've been very focused on. I want to find more inclusive decks, which was really difficult 6 years ago and is much more easy now. But is it because it is easier that it's really worth it? Good question. Let's go ahead and talk it through. For the francophones here, I'm just taking a minute to let you know that there is or there will be a similar video in French on the channel. So please, s'il vous plaît, allez plutôt regarder la vidéo en français dont les liens seront quelque part. How posh is this cup, right? Now I just need to be using it with... Okay, this way. No. Oh yes. Look at me, looking all posh and stuff. Okay. Enough with the silliness. Why do I feel the need to clarify and challenge the concept of inclusion or inclusivity before I move on with those videos on rather inclusive decks? Well, I think it's a rather tricky concept and a very neoliberal concept as well, that focuses a lot on the individual and doesn't ask for more change in structures, organizations, and especially not from the whole systemic thing of systemic racism, capitalism, sexism, heteronormativity, cis-sexism, and so on and so forth. So to me, what I hear when I hear inclusivity, and what I think a lot of people actually mean when they use it, is we have to make sure that the norm, the dominant paradigm, can ensure to make a little room for people who are oppressed. But what that means, we are going to include them in the actual paradigm, in the actual structure. So we're not going to change the actual structure, we are just going to make it so that a bit more people find their way into it. Which actually is just a new word for when we, earlier in the notice we had diversity politics, and diversity politics were aiming towards including or gathering more people from different backgrounds, ethnicity, abilities and so on the, how do you say? Werkvloer. Why do I have the word in Dutch? On the labor markets, work markets, how do you say that in English? I don't remember. So it was something that was going to incite more people to come into corporations in order to enhance productivity, increase profits, and so on. The main idea behind this concept was the more diverse we are and the more productive we will be. At first, I think it was more like something that was more internal in the structure, and then moving on, fast forward a couple of years, it has become something that was mostly a marketing argument, something to make sales, and not really something that was denoting any intentions behind it. And that's something that we actually see in decks, in tarot decks. So that's the first thing that I want to challenge. I'm not saying that my analysis here of everything that's been going on for the past, I don't know, 20 years or so is absolutely exact. I'm just trying to summarize. What I find interesting, it's also a very good example of co-optation, because we saw this inclusivity concept, especially in feminist circles. I don't know if it's the same in your country, but here in French-speaking countries, now every single feminist organization or collective needs to say that they are inclusive feminists, which is a good thing, because compared to, for example, trans, exclusionary feminist organizations and so on, we need to say and bring the signal that we are not that way. We want everyone to be able to see themselves in that feminism. However, most of the time it's just a buzzword, and there's no actual change in the structures to make room for people from more oppressed group or from different positionality or position on the scale or spectrum of power dynamics and power structures and power relations in our societies. So if it's just performative and there are no acts behind it, it's just meaningless. Well, it makes sense, but it's not changing the structure, it's not changing the relations, and we're kind of doomed with this very, very neoliberal, postmodern approach of things that's not going to change shit on the materialistic level, so on the systemic and structural level, right? I'm rather distrusting when it comes to inclusivity, because I fear that it's a lot of words, and good intentions, but not a lot of actions and risks taken. And I would say that eventually it's all good to try and make room for more diversity and representativity within the context where we are at this point, instead of dreaming someday it will be better and so on. It's bringing change now, but it's not revolutionary enough. And revolutionary not in the sense that we are waiting for a brighter future and that everything is going to explode and everything, because we know it's going to go on. When this is going to happen, every people who are in a more precarious, vulnerable position in our societies are going to be the first one to suffer from it, right? But revolutionary in the meaning that we change our communities, we change the way that we relate to one another, we go towards more interdependency, we prone for more accessibility, I would say, rather than inclusivity, because it's all fine and good to say, Sawin, please. It's all nice to say, oh, everybody's included in our structure, organization, whatever. And then when it's time to actually make room for people, the space is not even accessible for disabled people, fat people, and so on and so forth, because we all have different expectations when it comes to accessibility. So I would say that inclusivity is rather, it's just performative. I hope that we can ignite something different, incite more change in our actions than just saying we are inclusive. And actually, that's part of the problem as well. And I think that's the reason why I want to keep that word, inclusivity. At first I thought, oh, I'm just going to say inclusive decks because there's a consensus and everybody is going to know what I'm going to talk about. But come to think about it, I think that it's interesting to be using that word because it's telling us a lot about the context. A lot of the so-called inclusive decks, especially those which are branded as inclusive, not so much those with a more organic inclusivity showing through. A lot of those decks are actually created by rather privileged people. Most of them are still white, and you kind of need to be white to access the publishing house and all the mass market, decks market and so on. But also, to be running a Kickstarter or something, gosh, you really need a lot of energy and resources and time and stuff. It's not for anybody. I mean, maybe in a meritocratic word it is, but in my mind it's not. So I would argue that in a way this inclusivity when it comes to representation, and I do think that representation matter, that it changes something, that it switches something in our mindset, and that's changing the mentalities. It's a first step towards changing the structures. It's not enough, but it can be trigger something that incites you to change things, right? So that's all fine. But as much as representation matters, seriously, if it's always the same people who just got it, you know, that making the old decks that are all white, all thin, all heteronormative and stuff, it's not going to work anymore. So now they're just picking all their tokens to make decks that sell more. It doesn't change who get access to the cultural capital, the economic capital that comes with visibility as an artist and so on. And not only is it a matter of accessing it, but it's also who has it as a starting point in order to access those networks and these resources, including time to create a tarot deck, right? So when these decks say that they are inclusive, and not all of them use that word, but when they say that, they also kind of like, yeah, I'm just another white person doing a deck and trying to be inclusive. And to be honest, I'm working on a deck with my wife, and as white people, I think we are still doing we're still doing the same thing, basically. There are more and more decks, but which ones are really successful? Which ones are picked out by mass market publishers? I would say that saying that those tarot and oracle decks are inclusive also shows that there's no true representativity, that there's much more to do, and that it is a problem that there isn't more equity and access to art and publication as art creators in our society. That being said, I want to make sure that it's clear for everybody here that I'm not saying, oh, this deck, we should cancel it, it's not good, this is bad, nothing is perfect, and I want everyone to be, to have this activist purity and perfection and so on. This is absolutely not the case. I just want to challenge our thinking and our actions when it comes to so-called inclusivity. I very much feel like I'm the villain with my cats and my cup of tea. Sage, garden sage, the best. Is it the best? It's not, actually. I don't really adore it, but every now and then I do. Oh, stay here, darling, don't go, I need you, you're my best props. No tarot deck is ever perfect. It's really important for me to say that I'm not trying to say which deck is good or not. I'm not trying to call out anybody, to cancel anybody, to harass anybody. I just really want to bring some relief, to bring more layers to this topic, which is actually very trendy in the tarot community. I just wanted to bring little thoughts about it, and well, they are important to me, but it's not to say that they are the only way to think about that. Obviously, no deck ever is going to, nor should, tick all the boxes. I don't think it really matters. And especially when it comes to what I'm going to talk about right now, which is very important to me. It's also something that there's no strict rules that we have to obey or something. It's just there are pervasive stereotypes in decks, especially in so-called inclusive decks, that I want to point to. Someone who has been working on those topics for years and years, and who has a lot of interesting fascinating resources on their website is Azali Earthwork. There is the Tarot of the Cutie Puck, with a lot of tarot decks that are more representative. And there's also a lot of reviews on their websites, where in every reviews... No, sorry, stop. In every review they write, they would say, oh, but I want us to be careful because there's a black person in this card, which is kind of repetitive, it's a pattern at this point, and it perpetuates stereotypes. So this focus on stereotypical depictions in tarot cards is really interesting, and they go much further than I do. So I would really recommend that you go and check out their work. It's getting a bit old now. About 4 years ago, I published a column on the Little Red Tarot website, the old Little Red Tarot website community blog that doesn't exist under this shape anymore. In my Fattening Tarot column, I gave a lot of those examples, and yeah, it was pretty extensive, even though if I had to write it again now, I would probably phrase a lot of things differently, and actually I changed my mind on a lot of topics. That's okay, we all grow, and I still recommend you check out those articles. What I mean by stereotypical representations is when you have oppressed people, you have minorities in a deck, but for some reason they all are represented in a prejudiced way, and this actually, those stereotypes, they are directly related to the discriminations that those oppressed people, oppressed groups will face on a day-to-day basis. For example, because we were talking about my fat tarot column, let's talk about fat people. First of all, there's something that's really, and Azali writes so beautifully about that, that's very pervasive, is the exclusion of some type of minority from some suits in the decks or some specific cards. For example, go ahead and look for the fat people in the sword suits. Right, the air, the mind suits, the intellect suits. We are supposed to be so stupid. We are supposed to be lazy. What would we be doing in the suits that's all about being smart and everything? We're not there. We're very, very rarely there. Same with the suit of action wands. You don't see fat people on those. You do see fat people on Pentacles cards, but not the one with the hard-working people most of the time, but rather when it's about, you know, enjoying good food, having a good time, being quite chill, like the Nine of Pentacles, for example, or obviously, as always, the Queen of Pentacles. So that's something that's interesting. Why, when they are fat people, and usually they're not even fat, they're just less thin than the rest of the characters on the deck, why are they on the Empress cards or the Queen of Pentacles card? Please, can we stop with that? I can't even explain anymore why this is problematic. I can't. It's just so tiring. But here's the thing, when I say it's not all binary and something is good and something is bad. In some instance, for some of us as oppressed people, to reclaim the narrative, to subvert the narrative, to reverse the stigmatization process is quite important, and it's always been very important in oppressed people's struggles. So for example, my favorite card in a tarot deck is the Empress. As much as I'm tired of seeing fat empresses, gosh, I love the fat Empress, because that's the card that I identify with, and it's important for me to see fat impresses. And if I had to do a tarot card, of course I would have someone fat on the card that I identify the most with. Sometimes we do that with subversion, and sometimes it just makes sense for us to reclaim it, to escape from thin gaze and to not let the anti-fat narrative keep us in our place, and just say, you know what, I can be that if I want to, but I'm not going to follow your rules. I'm going to be that and much more, or differently, and so on. So that's a bit like there's some nuance to be brought here. And this goes for all the examples that I'm going to be bringing now. It is well known by now that it's kind of redundant to always have people in a wheelchair as the chariot, or in place of some knights. There is something interesting there, because we always see disabled people as passive, inactive, represented inertia, and in a way I think it's nice to see them in a position of movement. But what we forget is that what disabled people use as prostheses or orthese, I don't know how you say that in English, all of our helps and support system and all of our tools, they are not a means of transportation like a chariot is. They are a part of someone, an extension of them, and to be using that as a synonym, as a metaphor for movement, I mean, it's kind of problematic, right? It's okay, but in every so-called inclusive deck on the chariot cards, enough with that yet. Also, sometimes the wheelchair will be representing the usual throne of the queens and kings. Yeah, right. I would like to see someone in a wheelchair in a position where someone is supposed to be standing in usual cards, but then we changed the mindset that every position, every posture is supposed to be a symbol for something, a metaphor for something. We need to get out of that and to just appreciate that our bodies just are. Like, why pregnant people only as Empress or Queen of Pentacles? Can we not just see pregnant people on cards where they do not represent fertility or abundance or something new coming or whatever? Can we just have pregnant people for the sake of it because they are part of society? You see what I mean? And also, disabled people, visibly disabled people, we often see on typical or traditional cards of disability or illness. For example, we have someone with wearing crutches on the traditional 5 of Pentacles in the RWS, and a lot of so-called inclusive decks will put their disabled character firmly on this little box there so that they don't move. They hold their place, you know, the cliche of someone who needs help and who is so unhappy and doesn't dare to ask or doesn't know where to ask or doesn't reach out. This is so miserabilist. And we also have something that's kind of sensationalist as well, or kind of inspiration porn. Like on the 9 of Pentacles, we would often have someone who is either having visible wounds or bandages, or just have any kind of physical disability that we can see on a lot of decks, including inclusive decks. And in that case, the person will represent not only being wounded, but also the stamina, perseverance, showing up even though it's hard, being stronger than our bodies, the resilience. Enough with that. Our fucking disabled bodies are not your source of inspiration. They are not a metaphor for surpassing yourself. We don't need to surpass ourselves. We are just valid in those societies just as we are. We do not need to surpass ourselves in order to be legitimate, to be valid in your decks. We can very well be on any fucking cards in your decks. See what I mean? It's not so bad if it happens once or twice in a deck, but it's always like that. We are either people to be pitied or the inspiration source for able-bodied people. There's no in between, and I mean, what we ideally would want from decks is to represent the full circles, full spectrum experiences of people, the full spectrum of of our lives, and it is not by being put in our good little box that it's gonna change something. Except, you know, that's what I said about inclusivity, except reinforcing the structure of powers, the power system, to just keep us as minority. So, oh, it's all good. There is representation in some decks, but if the representation just shows the society as it is, or as it wants us to be, as fat people, as disabled people in these instances, why? What does it change, you know? Why don't we get access to the full spectrum of life experiences, of depictions? Why the only characters who still deserve it are rather young, white, heteronormative looking, cisgender looking, thin, able-bodied, and so on and so on? Why do marginalized bodies stand for something, for inspiration, for depiction or something? And why is natural or normal and questions always white and cis and so on and so forth? Why? That's why the most terrific tarot deck is the Next World Tarot, for example, because it doesn't give a shit about all of those things. There is a revolution going on. None of the marginalized people are keeping to their box, are playing the role that mainstream society and supremacist society expects of them. They are just out of bounds. They are free, they're unruly, they're where you don't expect them, and that is what we want. Same goes for Black people. Again, do we need to always see them on strength cards? What's the expectations towards especially Black women, who we always see on the strength card? Or in the one suit I was talking about as an earthwork before, it's someone who really explains in much more details a lot of those situations. Oh, it's all good to have Black people in your decks, but why are they still on the only cards in all the majors, the strength cards, with an animal? What does it mean as racist theory and as all of the theories that justified colonization? It insisted of Black people and indigenous people as closer to animals than actual humans. It is a white supremacist to just see Black people on those cards, or the moon cards, with also a connection with monstrosity, being an animal. This is a very, very, very big problem. If white creators only put Black people on those cards, what does it mean? Same with the Queen of Wands, or Wands card, for example. What does it say about the exotization of Black body and what is expected of them? When do we go into the cliche of the angry Black woman, racist cliche, obviously? When it comes to people of color, there is a lot of exotization and otherization, Orientalism as well. It all depends according to the decks. We have this old New Age cliche that I think is not so more prevalent anymore, but it was this idea that indigenous people were, especially native people in the United States of America, First Nation people, were associated with wisdom, ancestral wisdom, being connected to their roots and animism and so on. And they would not exist for themselves, but as a synonym, a representation, a metaphor for something else. Common enough for that. No, no. When it comes to trans representation, there's still a problem, classical problem. Trans and intersex representation is often connected to fluidity, navigating between the poles, between opposites, resolving dualities, trans, intersex, and non-binary bodies, let's say. And they're often used only as that, or as a symbol for subversion, blah, blah, blah. But again, do we need to reduce the wide variety of trans lives to those cliches? And what does it mean when we do about the place that we attribute, the role that those people and the agency that we live to this category in our society? It doesn't work. It really doesn't work. I'm just gonna take another example before this video gets way too long. Age. Oh, young people are the pages or are on the sun, and they are often representative of naivety. Oh, well, I don't know what kind of childhood you had, but for some of us it is not anything like that. On that topic, I think Lindsay Mack is really interesting as well. And then we have older people. Where do we see them? The kings, because they represent wisdom. Being old as having accomplished a lot in your life, having a lot to pass on with the 10 of Pentacles. The knowledge and the ability to go within, to analyze, like the hermit. For everything that I'm saying, there are a lot of counterexamples. There are a lot of good practices. It's not all about that, but I just want to raise attention here that it's still happening, and that inclusivity also needs to mean that we don't just keep marginalized people, oppressed people at the margins of society. I mean, I'm all for the margins. I think it brings something. It brings something in our... it's very clear, very interesting, but just when it comes to inclusivity, if you want to include people in your norm, in your society, in your communities, why would you then choose to put all the marginalized people and keep them closely in the margins of your decks or in the good boxes on your decks? Why? Oh, I'm speaking as you. Why would you do that? Why? It's just a way of speaking. It's just some speech thing. Obviously, I'm not trying to point my finger at anybody and saying, you don't do well, your deck is terrible because there's one of those cards. What are you doing? It's absolutely not the point. I'm just trying, to have us think about what we do. And in no way am I saying that this is exhaustive or it's always right, or that because of my background as well as a white person living in Belgium, coming from middle-class background, I'm not the best person to be talking about all of those examples that I took, and I'm pretty sure that some people will have some things to add what I say, or something to nuance, or even would want to contradict me, in which case go ahead and tell me what you think in the comments. Bon ben voilà. I think I summarized most of my ideas on the topic, even though I could be telling you more and more and more and more about it. But I'm closing those preliminary remarks here, and I will be seeing you soon for the next videos where I'm going to show you my collection of inclusive decks. Yeah! Obviously, we are talking about collection, which means that they are relative to my own tastes, what I like, my aesthetic preferences, and there are a lot of things that come into the balance when it comes to my choices and my collection, and which deck I acquire, I receive, and which decks I give away, or obviously. But it's gonna be fun because I have a nice collection. Thanks for bearing with me and my strange accent throughout these long videos. See you next time for the fun videos. The deck collection videos. Yay! See you, people!